Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. What if the biggest mistake leaders make about data is thinking that the value is in the data itself? Most organizations are drowning in dashboards, reports, and metrics, yet still struggling to make better decisions. In this episode of the CTO Playbook, I'm joined by Nic Granger, Chief Information and Financial Officer at the North Sea Transition Authority, to explore how data really creates value. We talk about why data is more of a human problem than a technical one, how purpose and pain unlock insight, and what CTOs must do to turn raw information into action. If you lead on data, this conversation may change how you think about it. And in an era when data volumes and complexity are growing exponentially, it is a topic that none of us can afford to ignore. I'm your host, Adam Horner, CTO coach to leaders from startups to enterprises, helping you lead with clarity, confidence, and strategic impact. If you ever feel like you're figuring this role out the hard way, you're not alone. That's why I created the CTO Playbook, a podcast and platform built for tech leaders just like you. You can explore coaching, cohorts, and stay up to date at thectoplaybook.com and start building your own playbook for your path at your pace. Now let's meet Nic and learn about her data playbook. Nic, welcome to the CTO Playbook.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. We've crossed paths through the CTO Craft and specifically being listed on the CTO Craft 100, which has been a wonderful honor. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation because you sit at a fascinating intersection between data, finance, and transformation. And you've actually done the hard yards of turning data into value.
Absolutely. I think data really is where the value is at the moment. So it's been an interesting few years.
So to set the scene for our listeners who may not know you or your background, who are you? What do you do today at the North Sea Transition Authority, which would be good to hear a little bit about them as well. And what is the problem that you spend most of your time actually trying to solve?
So I'm Nic, the Chief Information and Financial Officer at the North Sea Transition Authority, which is quite a mouthful. So to try and sort of break that down a little bit for some of the listeners. So I started with an IT degree, and then when I left uni, couldn't find an IT role that I wanted to do. I was aiming to be a business analyst. So had a lot of colleagues and friends that were working in the finance sector. So at that point stepped into what I now refer to as the dark side of accountancy. And actually what I found is that a lot of it is all about data, right? It's about data, it's about processes, how we do things. So in my role now at the NSTA, the North Sea Transition Authority, I have a kind of a blended portfolio of digital data, technology, and the transformation of those services, but also finance and then a few other core service delivery areas as well. I suspect most of the listeners haven't come across the NSTA. So we are a small government company. We regulate and influence elements of offshore energy. And in doing that, we've always said that we want to put data at the heart of what we do. We want to use data to enable both our colleagues and the industry that we're regulating to be able to add value.
Awesome. So what does good look like in your role when data is working well for the NSTA, but also for the companies that you regulate and the organizations that you oversee?
Yeah. So good looks like us being able to enable people to meet their purpose, right? So as an organization, we've got three key priorities. We regulate and influence, but we do that across different areas. We ensure security of energy supply for the UK. We decarbonize that supply through emissions reductions as much as possible. And also at the same time, we're accelerating the energy transition. So what good looks like from a data point of view, from a technology point of view, is not the actual data and tech itself. It's outcomes that it enables to deliver. So on accelerating the energy transition, we've got colleagues that are setting up the carbon storage industry in the UK. You can't do that if you don't understand the subsurface, the rocks, the geology, all of those things. And to do that, you need data. So I think what good looks like is furthering all of those purposes, both us, but also the wider sector and industry as well.
Okay. And so when you say energy transition, and I'm presuming here, so please correct me if I make the wrong assumption, that is the transition from sort of fossil fuels to renewables and other forms of energy storage. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So essentially what we're saying is we know that the country always needs power. We have a need currently that can only be met through some of the traditional forms of energy like oil and gas. That need shouldn't be in there in the future. So how can we ensure that the sector does that transition in a managed way that retains jobs in the economy, that builds the supply chain, but also enables those key priorities of moving towards net zero as a country, but ensuring that the country has the power it needs at the current time.
Excellent. Okay. And I've done a little bit of work with one North Sea power organization, and I saw the amounts of data that they had in outlines. And or that there's really quite large numbers. So can you sort of put it into context for us? Just how big approximately is the sort of the volume of data that you're dealing with on, for example, an annual basis?
Yeah, sure. So we took on an industry collection of data, and when we did that, it had about 15 terabytes in it. We now have 1.7 petabytes of data. So that's quite a large industry collection that we're kind of the custodian of. So yeah, we're talking large quantities of data like seismic data, anything that enables you to understand a geographical area or a geological area. Quick summary, maps and rocks. That's what our data is about. But large quantities, yeah.
Yeah, because I did that when I was working at Palantir, and that was the first time I came across a yottabyte. So when in terms of the volumes of data you're talking about, these are truly ginormous sums of data that when you try and think about, for example, transmission of this amount of data, it takes a considerable amount of time to just move it around, never mind process it.
And that's one of our roles, right? So that we can act as the custodian of the data. We can hold it so it's in one place, so it doesn't need to be duplicated across the industry. You don't need to be pulling all of that data in one go and trying to duplicate it and hold it in different stores. If we can enable that data to be high quality, really accessible, then it becomes interoperable and we can actually hold it without that need for tons of store all over the place.
Excellent. And so just to give us a bit of a flavor for the role and some of the challenges you faced, what surprised you most when you stepped into this CIFO role?
I think it was firstly the passion people have for data management, which is not something that you perhaps expect when you go into roles. I think there was a real understanding of the importance of data. I think there was a real will to transform things like legacy tech stacks and things like that to enable people to access it better. So that surprised me that the enthusiasm was there. I think the challenge that was there, even though there was a ton of enthusiasm, was and this is not going to be new to most people in these kind of roles, right? The silos data, the fact that the data is trapped in legacy platforms and hasn't actually found a way to expose that and bring that out so people can use it. So I think a pleasant surprise in terms of ambition, perhaps the standard challenges that we all see in kind of CTO and tech roles, data.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's a very common challenge to see that where we've got this data, but then how can we actually get access to it? Now, you've worked across sectors, but also internationally, and now in this sort of highly complex data-heavy environment. So when you look back, tell us a little bit about some of the experiences that have shaped how you think about data today, not necessarily as a technical asset, but I'm thinking more as a leadership tool.
Yeah, I think, so as a starting point, leadership's mainly about people. So when you talk about tech and data and transformation through data, you think of the petabytes, you think of the coding, you think of all of these kind of wide technical topics. But actually, the important bit in terms of leadership is people, the skills, the culture that you need to be able to do things to turn the petabytes into actual value. For me, it's that blend mix of getting the right people, the right culture in the organizations, and that enables you to do what you want to, the fun, exciting things with the technology side.
Awesome. So very much people first, and then using the data as a way to generate outcomes through the people.
Absolutely.
Cool. And was there a moment in your careers where you sort of realized that having data and using data well are sort of two different things?
I think so, right? So we were talking just a moment ago about the volume of data. That's a really easy metric, but actually it doesn't tell you anything at all, other than you've got to store a large volume of data. I think the point for me was actually how can you get non-data professionals talking about the value that has been added? So for us, for example, in carbon storage, we saw that our data downloads on the day that our colleagues put out a licensing round went up by 20-fold. So that's not about quantity, that's about the number of people trying to access and download data. So there's a very clear link to the licensing round itself. Actually, that data download's not the interesting bit in terms of outcomes. It's about then the issuing of licenses that will enable the UK to potentially capture up to 10% of its annual emissions a year. That's the important outcome, but that's not possible without having both a large quantity of data, but also the high quality, the accessibility of the data. So for me, it's that turning point of knowing that you can't achieve what you want to achieve without the data is the really crucial point.
Yeah, and that's something sort of mirrors, I guess, one of my early discoveries that I worked for HMRC, but not for HMRC, but with HMRC when I was a consultant. I came across something similar, which is HMRC gathers, so for those people not familiar, that is the tax authority for the UK. And they gather all of the, for example, income records for people, for companies and people in the UK. And they obviously gather quite a large amount of data. But the interesting thing about it, as you said, it was like, well, so what does this mean? Yeah, clearly you've got to to do something with each one of these things as sort of a routine business action to it. But then understanding what does the data mean in aggregate when you put it all together. And so the moment I realized it was useful when you can go, okay, can we actually sort of bucketize this stuff and put it into different categories and then see what that means for us and work on it from there. So an analogous kind of experience, but also with fairly large amounts of data. But it comes back to exactly what you said. You can't do that unless you've got the basics sorted out and working well, because otherwise you're just worrying about the fundamentals.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the challenges we've got at the moment is most people now want to jump to talk about AI, machine learning, data analytics, all sorts of words that people are seeing in the business press at the moment. They're using in their own sort of daily lives. But actually the conversations and the bits where we need to put the people and the money are in those foundations. Do we have high quality data? Does it have the right standards, the right metadata? Is it consistently accessible across the piece? For us, that's a whole sector as opposed to like one company. So I think those are the things that we are working on a daily basis, right? Getting the right data architecture to enable people to access the data. Those are not necessarily interesting to people that want to deliver those outcomes. So linking the outcome and how we can achieve it, the fact we need to deliver on all the data foundations, fundamentals, whatever word you want to use for it, that I think is the important part of the challenge that we all have to try and solve. How do we link those two together so that people understand it enough to know that they're on the path to getting that outcome, but they don't need to fall into the details on the acronyms and the technology side that we've used a lot on.
Because we know there's a lot of acronyms to take care
Absolutely.
of. Yeah. And clearly you work with quite a lot of players in this industry because it's a big industry, and B, it's pretty diverse in terms of the goals and aims of them all. Perhaps it's a slightly unfair question, but what do you think that organizations normally get wrong with this stage of, okay, what is it that we want to do with our data?
I think there's probably a couple of things that we've all fallen into the trap of getting wrong, right? Jumping to the point and the solution that you think you need immediately. So I think AI is a good example, right? Where can we use AI in our organization rather than what are the challenges that we are currently trying to solve and what's the right tool to solve them? AI might be one of those tools. I think we all collectively in all sorts of organizations jump to the solution and then try to enable that solution rather than start with the problem.
Start with the problem. I think it's a wonderful piece of advice pretty much no matter where you are. And talking about starting, what I'd like to do then is to just sort of go back a bit, wind the clock back a bit and have a look sort of early on when you first started leaning into sort of data-led decision-making, handling data, dealing with data. There must have been some things you discovered along the way that were harder than you expected early on.
I think the challenge with data is that things never stop and slow down. Data is always being generated every single day, right? So one of the challenges we had was that we had a data collection that dated started back in the 1960s and has carried on. Now, a lot of volume, you asked me earlier about volume, a lot of our volume has been a more recent data because if you're capturing data now, it's captured to a level of detail that perhaps wasn't so much historically. But in terms of our challenges on the data front, a lot of it has been that historic data. So that data wasn't necessarily being captured to make decisions. It was being captured through either a transaction or somebody doing something. That means for us that a lot of our data is trapped into PDFs. And when I say PDFs, I mean things that have been printed off an old school printer. You can see the lines, the circles down the left-hand side where someone has put them in a lever file. They've lifted it out of the lever arch file. They've put it through a photocopier. They've scanned it a few times. They've created a PDF. That's not machine readable. So one of our big challenges is what do you do with that historic data collection where you might have really important, vital data, but you don't know because you can't read it with a machine. It's very high volume in terms of numbers of files, so you can't go through them all. So I think for us, that challenge of thinking about the collection in a different way, thinking about it as how we can add the value means us looking at some of those challenges in terms of the quality in the start.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? So data very often was collected almost as a byproduct of doing the business, really historically. Then there was an element of, data's important. So it's collected in line with the process, but still not always in the most readable or usable way. And then later on, more recently, it's being gathered proactively in the conscious idea that we are going to leverage it. And so often you end up with this massive recency bias on the data, don't you?
There's the potential for that. I think that this is one of the places where we are seeing some of the new tools enabling us to find out whether there is value in that older data. So being able to convert documents to be machine readable, we're trying to use AI to extract structured data from those unstructured PDFs. And I think that enables us as an organisation to not go back to the industry we're regulating and saying we now need this data. We're looking at ways that we know that we've got the data, but it's currently trapped in an inaccessible form. So I think it's not necessarily about the most recent is the most valuable, but it's where is the value and can we access it in a way that benefits outweigh costs.
Right. And I think that's another key point, is not all data is equally valuable.
No. And I think for us, as we're looking at the energy transition, for us, one of the ways we see our data being used is for spatial planning of the marine environment. Some areas in that marine environment might be more useful for carbon storage, for example, than others. Well, for us, that means we don't necessarily want to look at the whole basin and do the same thing with all the data. So we have been targeting our efforts into certain areas where we think that data could add more value in terms of those outcomes.
And I can see that because I think there's something that I discovered, because I worked at Palantir, which does a lot of data analytics, and a lot of their customers are worried about sometimes large volumes of data, but the real value for them comes in being able to combine data, often data that doesn't look like it's easily combinable. And it's the intersection of that, because then it shows you, okay, this part of the data is valuable because I can combine it with something else. This other part of the value isn't. And so some of the data feels obvious. Look, that's clearly got value on its own, never mind. But then sometimes it has sort of multipliers when you combine it with other data, which on first glance isn't always obvious, A, that it will combine, and B, how it will have value beyond that. So is that something that you've sort of come across over time, where not only data on its own, but data sort of multiplication creates this additional value? And if you have, how on earth did you figure out which bits are going to have value and which bits did not?
I think one of the challenges that second part of the question is always really hard, because for us, the outcomes might be in 10, 15, 20 years as opposed to now, whereas we're trying to identify that value quicker. I think certainly what we've seen with, we created something called the National Data Repository back in 2021, and that brought all of that industry data into one place. So after certain confidentiality periods, that data is now available. So if you wanted to, you could create a user ID, log into our platform. Where we're seeing the value is by making that data available to organizations or companies that might not have had the data in their own right. So academia, for example, would data purchases a big part of any research project. Making that data freely available opens that up to a new sector. So a lot of the carbon storage work is being done in academia as research. It also enables smaller companies just coming into the basin to access data that they might not have been able to access. And we know that people are then using that to train AI and to enable the use of that in different ways. If everybody had that data in their silos, the asset's still the same, but the value is in bringing all that data together and being able to use it in a different way. So we're definitely seeing that as a growing area.
And so for disseminating value and distributing the value, I can see how that works quite well, because you end up with, as you said, it enables competition, especially as smaller players, entrance into the market who otherwise might have a barrier to entry that would be either cost or accessibility. Is resistance from the big players who have spent a lot of time and effort building up this data, that they kind of want to maintain proprietary ownership of some of this data?
So it's interesting. You asked me earlier about what some of the challenges or what some of the things I was surprised at when I came into the sector. I was expecting resistance, but actually we've gone out directly a couple of times and done public consultations on this area. What type of data should we make available? How long after it's created should we make it public? Those kind of things. We've not actually seen resistance in that. We've actually seen a load of support, because I think the sector as a whole is data hungry. We're talking about a STEM-based industry who want data. It enables them to understand, make better decisions, identify new areas of business. So the overall value, I think, is seen by all of the players. I think one of our areas has always been a little bit more challenging is how long we keep the confidentiality period. So certain bits of data we make available really quickly. Other data, particularly ones which have a huge cost to collect, we have a longer confidentiality period on. And actually that approach of not having one size fits all has been received really well by industry.
Right. So that's kind of the magic balance there is, share the data, but you as an authority will have access to all of it because there's a mandate for you to collect it. But then you make that available on a timeline that's roughly commensurate with the cost of collecting it in the first place. That's a really cool insight. And I imagine that can probably be applied to quite a few other different areas and probably represent something of a turning point, especially in the North Sea Basin, for exactly that reason. I mean, was there a point in time when this regulation came in, it's like suddenly this all changed? Was it as simple as that? I mean, I say simple, I know it's not easy, but...
Essentially, yes. So we've always had data collection going on, but we had new legislation that came in 2016 that has enabled this to be much more set out and structured so people understand it. We review that. We've just had go live the carbon storage version of that legislation. So we're collecting from that new industry as well. But I think there is certainly a belief or a growing belief that open data is the way to go. We're talking almost about a commodity here. The competitiveness is really in ways of working rather than the licenses themselves. So for us, opening up that data as much as is possible is definitely something going forward we'll see a lot more of, I think.
Right. And I guess some of that perception of value is also because of the fact that the majority value is a physical process, either taking something valuable out of the ground or using the ground in a way to store, transmit, or otherwise. So the value isn't in the data. The value is in something the data enables or perpetuates.
Exactly that.
And as you were going through that process, I mean, clearly there was some fairly high stakes. There was a lot of people who needed convincing, but were there any moments where sort of either the whole project or the data approach where something nearly went wrong, some near misses?
I'm sure there are lots of them, and I've probably forgotten more of them.
Any that stand out in your mind, though?
I think for us, it's been around our own data, actually, so less of industry data. But whilst we're only about 10 years old as a company, we brought in people from lots of different regulators. And so we've got data and transactions and systems that date back to the late 90s, early 2000s. Now, going back to the comment earlier that those systems were transactional, they weren't data collection systems, but the data that is in those transactions can offer real insight to what we're doing now and what we can be doing with the industry going forward. So I think one of our big challenges, things that perhaps went wrong, was perhaps not seeing early on the value that could be collected from our own systems. So we did this sort of national data repository and external data collection, but actually we missed the point that the value we held ourselves could add value in its own right. So that's our next bit we're working on, is that data that's kind of been trapped in those transactional systems. How do we expose and pull that data out and extract it and use it alongside the industry data to inform and make better insights?
I mean, that seems like a slightly unexpected insight. I've got to ask, what was the sort of the trigger for figuring that out?
I think by making data available, our wider team across the organisation started to ask more questions. And what if we could do this? And what about that? And we know this for a company, but we don't know this for ourselves. How can we do this differently? So I think there was a real pull from our kind of internal data consumers to say, okay, but why don't I know this? Why do I have to keep 80 spreadsheets to be able to work out when a milestone on a license is? Why isn't there a dashboard that does that for us? So I think that our approach on training our team internally to have the digital skills to be able to use industry data has opened up the question much more of, okay, now we want our data.
And that very much comes back to this sort of what you started out with, is a human view of technologies, sort of listening to your own people and hearing the questions internally and then going, oh, hang on a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think digital skills and data skills involved in that is quite often overlooked. So sort of 15 years ago, every job description had the need for Microsoft Office products, right? Excel, Word. You wouldn't employ someone who didn't have those kind of basic IT skills. I think the next step of that, the data skills, the skills on digital tools, how can we extract insight? Do our team know how to write a prompt to be able to use Copilot or one of the other tools? And I think that's becoming so much more important to just everyday sort of office life.
Absolutely. And I think that's very much going from what I think of as being data to insight. And it's sort of the key journeys. And it's not always obvious. But I know you say every organization should be recruiting every person with that in mind. I get the impression that definitely doesn't happen.
Oh, no, I think that's utopia. I think that's where we're all looking towards. I think what we've created a digital academy in-house. We're relatively small, so we don't tend to create content ourselves, but signposting people towards existing learning or training on topics like Power BI or use of Copilot. Those are the two that we're getting the most requests for at the moment. I think just having that ability to point people in the right direction, because there are so many things you could be doing. You can go on any platform and you can find all this training and learning. So the request we had from our team was, okay, but which one should we be doing? And just focusing people into one direction, I think, is a really good starting point.
And I think that kind of brings you back to one of the key points, is actually just going around the organization saying, what's actually troubling you in your day-to-day work?
Absolutely. Because again, you don't want to jump to that solution, right? You don't want to start with the solution and then work back to try and find a problem in the organization. All organizations have plenty of problems. You just need to ask people what they are.
And so in that process of going from problem with a solution to, using data to provide a convenient or useful solution, less Excel, more sort of Power BI or prompting, at what point do you think it is in there where you sort of go, okay, this is a basic question is, how do I get access to data? Another question is, how do I leverage the data for whatever leverage means in a particular organization? Do you see that as a sort of a transition point inside an organization that happens sort of relatively atomically, or is that something that's more of a sort of a slide over time?
I think it's definitely a slide over time. I think if you try and do that as a very conscious move, it can be really quite challenging because nobody knows what that point, the perfect world looks like, right? But I think if you do that in an iterative way and start to get one person extra a week asking the question of how do I get to my data? And they don't necessarily ask it in that way. They'll be asking the question in all sorts of different ways. I think that's you've got much better likelihood of achieving the outcomes than you want than trying to go big bang and get everybody on board at a time. We've certainly found we piloted innovation time. So the same as sort of the big names, right? The 20% time of Google from sort of probably 25 years ago now, was it? And tried to apply that a little bit better. So we piloted it for a while in my team, and then we now do that across the organization. So the last Wednesday afternoon of every month, we have innovation time across the organization, and that time's almost protected time. People could be innovation, it could be learning and development on a topic of their choice. It could be just sitting down with colleagues and thinking about, is there a better way that we could do what we're doing? And having that time in the diary for the whole organization has enabled people to start thinking a little bit differently, not just on data, but across innovation and transformation as a whole.
And I guess in a world where it's so much easier for pretty much anybody with tools like Lovable and Base 44 to be able to create things fairly quickly from scratch, and of course, leveraging all the internal resources you already have, I can imagine that's leading to an explosion of tools. Is my imagination off base there, or are you seeing that as well?
We're seeing that. I think it's been slow in some areas. We're certainly seeing a ton of ideas coming forward of, I'd really love to be able to do this, but I'm not quite sure how to achieve it, or I need other colleagues' support to be able to do it. We've certainly seen dashboards popping up all over the place in terms of trying to get insight out really quickly. So I wouldn't say that we've got like a huge now innovation portfolio that is sort of driving a whole load of products, but we're certainly seeing a change in the culture in terms of how people want to do things and the questions that they're asking.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you mention questions and dashboards, I mean, clearly then you've got a way of collating the feedback, the questions, the requests from the organization. And I would say in a lot of the smaller organizations I work in, that's something that's often absent, mainly because people are just sprinting to keep up with the current pace of change and not necessarily getting that time to think further ahead, or what would be nicer in my role if I could do something simpler. And then there are those people who just go ahead and just build it, throw together a spreadsheet or throw together a new app or something. And you'll always get, 8.5% of the innovators and makers in any population that you look at. So I guess the question for me is getting the whole organization to go from data, and in your case, absolutely loads of it, into useful and credible insight. I mean, where do you sort of start asking from how to go from, well, okay, this is basics, and now let's think about doing something centrally. Let's do something that is more structured.
I honestly think that piloting is a great place to start, right? If one person sees that somebody else has been able to do something quickly or in a different way, then they're like, well, why can't I do that? Why haven't I been given the opportunity to look at things in a different way? So I think, we've done a few things over the last few years. About 5-6 years ago, we ran agile training for the whole organization. So we said we're seeing that this works really well. The traditional teams that have used agile since the 2000s, the dev teams and things like that, they're using it in the organization. How are they turning out these products so quickly? So we did that we made it mandatory for our leadership, then offered it to anybody else. What we started to see was people thinking about their day jobs differently and how they could achieve things in a different way. So we saw our organizational strategy that perhaps would have usually taken about 18 months was compressed to an 8-month delivery period by using not agile as a methodology, but some of the tools and tips and tricks that you take out of the agile space. So I think that started people seeing things in a different way, which then led to the piloting and the running of innovation time. So for me, I think it is that iteration. It's giving people the opportunity to do things differently and taking it from there.
Excellent. So sort of iteration, but also a strong sort of process-bound approach to executing pretty much any project across the organization then.
Yeah, and I think challenge is finding the balance between what people see as bureaucracy and process that enables them to do their job quicker and in a different way. And I think some of that is in the terminology, right? So when we were rolling out those programs, we stopped using the word process and we started using the word workflow. So how can you do your work in a different way? How do you want your daily work to flow from 9 a.m. to 5, rather than you need to sit down with a process engineer and map your processes? That switches off a whole ton of people who don't want to think in that kind of way. So I think think terminology is a big enabler in some of those kind of things.
Interesting. Yeah. So cultural stigma around particular words. Process, I can see why that might be one of them. There may be other words in any other organization that people try. So avoid those words that have sort of negative connotations attached to them. Use a language that is more progressive and that people are going to accept. And use it, because I often talk about the sort of two boundaries you want to avoid is that an organization kind of zigzags between too much process and too much chaos. And it is essentially having good workflows is sort of the perfect razor edge line in the center of it. But most organizations bounce either side of that, sometimes fairly aggressively. But I like the idea of using the concept of agile and agility across the organization. That's pretty smart. So then in terms of taking advantage of those workflows with data that you've already got potentially, or where you're lacking data, how do you sort of go through a fairly straightforward look at what data you've got?
I'm not going to pretend we're perfect at this, right? So I think everybody could always get better. And you've got like the really procedural structural way of doing it, making sure you've got information owners, making sure you've got custodians, you're all using standards, you're all using metadata. I'm sure the people listening to this are comfortable with all of that. People that aren't listening to that are just hearing a really dreary, boring topic that they really don't want to engage with. So I think for me, understanding where the value from your data and where your data is and all of those questions, yes, it comes down to having good data governance, but it also comes down to really understanding what your organization is trying to achieve and working backwards. So for us, those three key priorities of ensure energy security, reduce emissions, and accelerate the energy transition. For us, it's looking for data in the organization or in the data we are the custodian of that enables those three priorities to move forward, rather than taking the other approach of trying to identify all of your data and trying to identify absolutely every element of it and talking about data a lot, but not using the word data, I think is the other key to it.
Excellent. Okay. And then, so once you've figured out, okay, so what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? Figuring out in people's day, how can we improve their workflows? And then I guess we've got some sort of data that we can use and look at. Maybe there's even some gaps in that, and hopefully that is standardized and formed and all the rest of it. What next?
Next is bringing it all together, right? It's saying, okay, we've got all of those different parts of it, but what can we do if we merge all of it together? So I'll give you an example. So one of the challenges we had a particularly almost paper-based approach, sort of in the pre-lockdown days, where one of our colleagues would take a pile of paper onto a trolley and push the trolley from one person to the next person as they completed their part of process. That meant that the data in all of that wasn't being captured unless someone happened to put it into their own spreadsheet that they maintained and only they had access to. And we said, okay, we've got a couple of things here. We've got a really long process, not because because there's only one set of documents and that needs to move along the process, but we also know that the topic itself, we could get great insights from, but we can't because 10 people are capturing little bits of data in their part of that process. So we said, okay, how can we do this in a different way? So we ended up digitalizing that whole process, putting it into a portal where the applicant put all of the information and data in at the start, and then using workflows pinged off to the right person at the right time. They could make a decision, they could analyze what they needed to analyze. It meant that some people could do their work concurrently rather than waiting for one person to finish before they could move on. And
which is a great optimization in its own right.
Yeah. Exactly. But it also meant that data was being captured, and it meant that people could use data from other colleagues' part of the process in giving greater insights to their part of it.
Another efficiency.
Yeah,
cool.
We could then pull out those data insights if we needed to be able to predict trends for the future and all of those kind of things. So bringing those all together, along with the digital skills that I talked about and making sure that people were comfortable, this was not a process to remove jobs from the process. This was a process to make people's work better and more focused on the areas they needed to spend greater time at. And I think that example of where you can take something that actually was a problem, right? It was far too long from A to Z. How can you do that in a way? You can only do that by bringing those bits together, by bringing the processes, understanding what people really don't like about their day job, and bringing the data in as well.
And that must also go across a number of different departments. So this isn't exactly one leader you can go to and go, hey, just sign off on this, please.
No, so that involved probably every area of our organisation and also some colleague departments as well in the broader public sector that needed to feed into some of those steps.
So getting buy-in for those changes that's a non-trivial part of a process change that's that fundamental then.
Yeah, and again, I think that goes back to the terminology point of explaining to people what you're trying to do. You're trying to make their day job better. You're not trying to get rid of, and I know other organisations will have different priorities, but our priority was not to cut jobs and make redundancies. It was how can we do what we're doing quicker, better, in a way that enables people to enjoy their work, right? So we've always had a priority around great place to work, and it's not a great place to work if you're dealing with tons of paper and you've got to wait on other people. You've got those handover points. That's always where the frustration comes from. So yeah, I think it's worked. We just need to continue to do that process across some of the other areas as well.
I think that's amazing. And I think if we're going to try and make this ready to consume format for our listener CTOs to take and use for your sort of data to value playbook, let's see if we can sort of come out with step 1 then is to understand the purpose and the mission. Those are the 3 core goals for the NSTA. Step 2, which I found interesting, is a very fun place to start, is just the worst part of people's working day.
And I think if people can't describe their worst part of their day, everybody complains about it, right? It's what you go home and you complain to your other half about. I really didn't like this bit of my day. So I think it's a good part to get people talking.
Yeah, and it's also one of those areas where the data collection at the water cooler is one of those other fun situations to do that if you can't get it any other way. But anyway, step 3 then, and I think that this was also useful, was looking honestly at the data that you already have. And I think the point that brought that to life here was the data you had internally but weren't using, whereas you had it from some of your client customer organizations and were able to leverage that, but just not the internal data. So step 4 then, bringing it all together. And I think that's the bit that sounds simple but is terrifyingly not easy, I think, and that is connecting the purpose, the pain, and the data together into value. But then in order to actually make that happen, we needed step 5, which was bringing the key stakeholders along, whether that's the board, whether that's the executive team, or a combination of that.
Absolutely. And for me, that step 5 those steps aren't necessarily sort of running one after the other. I think step 5 is one that kind of underpins all of them. It happens all the way through. You need your board or your leadership team, whoever it is, to be bought in to be able to give you the money to start it off, and the culture and the organization. You need to continue to feedback. So step 5 is almost something that kind of cycles round through all of those steps in that process.
Underpins all the others. Yeah. So the others may be sequential, but that one is very much runs all the time through the whole thing. That's a very good point. Excellent. Nick, I'd love to sort of quickly ask you a couple of questions and finish off, but I've been distracted. For those of you not watching on the video version of this, Nick's been drinking from a mug covered in bats. And I have to say, that's entirely unusual as a mug to drink out of. Tell me a little bit about the background on this one, Nick.
Sure. So alongside my day job, I sit on a couple of boards, charity boards, mainly with a focus on digital and data or skills. However, I also sit on the board of the Bat Conservation Trust, which is the sort of UK's leading charity for the conservation of bats. So it doesn't have a digital data aspect, this particular one, but it's something I'm quite passionate about.
And how did you get involved with this in the first place? Was it just one of those things where you thought, oh, bats are lovely and cuddly, I want to help out there? Is it as simple as that, or is there a bit nicer, bigger story to it than that?
Yeah, so before I was on the Bat Conservation Trust, I was sat on a board for Falklands Conservation. So I spent 10 years living and working in the Falklands, and I got really interested in conservation. I should say not bats. In the Falklands, it was more sort of penguins and whales and various other things. But for me, it just sort of started up a passion around conservation in general. So I saw an advert for the Bat Conservation one and thought, I'll join that. So I'm now learning more about bats than I ever thought was possible. There are 18 species of bat in the UK, which I didn't know before I joined the organisation. So yeah, it's good fun.
Oh yeah, because bats have been in the news quite a lot recently. They've been connected to quite a few of the major events of the last few years. COVID being one of them, but I'm glad to say there was no UK bats involved in COVID.
No.
A wonderful detour, and thank you for explaining that to us. Back to the tech, yes. If I may then. If you were sort of talking to a CTO you just met, and there's sort of only one thing that they could do well in the next 90 days to really excel with their data, what would you have them prioritize and why?
Finding out the major pain point in the organization. That's the starting point. If you can find that out, then you can look at ways you can create value through the use of data. You can bring people on board into all of your data priorities around the foundational stuff, around data governance, data architecture, all of those things. But you can't do that if you don't know what that major pain point or challenge in the organization is.
So find the bit that hurts when you press it first and deal with that.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Nick, it's been absolutely wonderful to speak to you. If anybody would like to carry on the conversation, what is the best way for folks to get in touch with you?
Sure. The best way is over LinkedIn. I'm relatively straightforward. I'm Nic Granger, LinkedIn. So take a look and connect with me there.
Excellent. We can put a link to that in the show notes. Nick, thank you very much for your time today. It's been wonderful.
Really good chatting to you, Adam.
Thank you for listening to the whole episode. I appreciate your time. So just before you go, I'd like to ask you for a favour in return for putting together this episode of the CTO Playbook for you. Please share the episode with just one person who will appreciate it. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or another platform, sharing the episode will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great content. Remember that you can find more information on the CTOplaybook.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.